Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're tackling something pretty powerful.
Powerful,
It's
yeah.
not just information, it's like a whole new way of looking at things, maybe.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going to be exploring the book of Galatians,
Ooh, Galatians.
which is a letter written almost 2,000 years ago,
Wow.
but you'd be surprised how much it still has to say about the way we live now.
It's amazing, right? How this ancient wisdom just keeps speaking to us.
It really does. We're using excerpts from this analysis we found, which focuses on the first two chapters.
Okay.
And specifically the theme of grace. We're going to see how it tackles like social pressure, purpose, and even how we treat people who are different from us.
It's a concept that has shaped history and continues to challenge us today.
Totally. Okay, so chapter 1 starts off with a bang.
Oh, really?
Paul, the author, is writing to the Galatians, and he is astonished.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they're turning away from this idea of grace, the very thing that sets them free. And you can just feel that urgency in his words.
Okay.
He actually says, and I quote,
Okay.
I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one.
That's such a powerful statement, and it really speaks to the heart of what Paul is trying to get across.
Right.
To understand, like, why he's so fired up, we got to remember the context.
Okay, the context.
Yeah, back then, there were all these different gospels going around.
Okay, different gospels.
Yeah, some emphasizing, strict adherence to Jewish law as the path to salvation. But Paul, he's preaching this radical message.
Huh?
Salvation comes through grace, not through what we do or how well we perform.
Oh, wow. So these different gospels were basically different ways of understanding how to connect with God.
Exactly.
And Paul was saying, nope, there's only one way, and it's through grace.
Right. That must have been pretty controversial back then.
Yeah, I bet. Challenging the whole system.
Totally. Paul's message was shaking things up big time. It disrupted the religious and social norms of his day.
Yep. Challenging authority figures and everything people believed about their connection with God.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more interesting is that he didn't learn this from some traditional teacher or anything.
Really?
It was a direct revelation, a complete 180 from his life before, when he was actually persecuting Christians.
Wow, so a total transformation.
Exactly. Knowing his background is key to understanding how strong his conviction was.
Yeah.
He had been this zealous Pharisee dedicated to upholding the law. But then he had this incredible encounter with Jesus that completely changed everything.
Wow, that's amazing. It kind of makes you think, how often are we stuck in our own little boxes?
Yeah, our own different gospels, so to speak.
Right. Where do we get our sense of worth and purpose from? Are we always trying to earn it, or are we open to the possibility that it's already there for us freely given?
That's the million-dollar question. And if Paul's right, and grace is the true foundation, then it changes everything about how we live, how we interact with each other, and how we see ourselves.
Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2, where Paul heads to Jerusalem to meet with the other apostles.
Oh, interesting.
This isn't just a casual get-together, though. This is a high-stakes meeting to make sure everyone's on the same page about this whole brain thing.
Got it. So what happens there?
Well, they actually managed to achieve unity. They all agree that this message of grace isn't just for a select few. It's universal.
Wow, that's powerful.
It transcends all those cultural and religious boundaries.
So they're all saying that this idea of grace, this unearned acceptance from God, is at the core of their faith.
Exactly. But then things take a turn.
Oh no, what happens?
Peter, one of the most well-known apostles, starts acting in a way that goes against this whole principle. He starts distancing himself from Gentile believers because of social pressure.
Really, Peter the Rock, the guy who walked with Jesus, is caving to social pressure.
I know, right? It really shows the struggle between what we know is right and actually living it out in a complicated world.
You're telling me, even Peter, who saw firsthand how radically inclusive Jesus was, still struggled to fully embrace grace when faced with societal norms.
Makes you think, huh?
Definitely. And then what's crucial is how Paul reacts to this.
Okay, how does he react?
He calls Peter out publicly.
Whoa, he does. That's intense.
Ah.
Why make such a big deal out of it, though?
Because for Paul, grace wasn't just some abstract idea. It had real-world consequences. It wasn't just about your personal relationship with God. It was about how you treated others, especially those who were different from you.
So basically, Paul's saying if you really get grace, it changes how you interact with everyone, not just the people you're comfortable with.
Exactly. It's about breaking down walls, not building them up.
And this is where Galatians gets to its core message.
Okay.
In chapter 2, verse 16, Paul writes, and I'm quoting again, "We know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. You can't earn God's love. It's freely given.
It's powerful stuff. We hear about this concept of justification by faith a lot, but what does it actually mean for someone living in today's world?
That's what I'm wondering. Like, how does that apply to us?
Well, think about all the ways we try to prove ourselves, trying to earn love and acceptance and success. We always feel like we have to be good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough.
Oh, yes, definitely.
And Paul is saying we can let go of all that striving because our worth isn't based on what we do, but on who we are in relation to God.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. It's radical.
So instead of constantly trying to earn our worth, we can rest in the fact that it's already given to us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that is an incredibly relevant concept for us today.
You can say that again. This is really making me think.
It has some profound implications for everything we do, from our relationships to our work to how we see ourselves.
This is definitely a deep dive worth taking. I'm already seeing how these ideas from Galatians can challenge us and maybe even change our lives.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore when it comes to how grace affects not just us as individuals, but also society as a whole.
This is just the beginning. I'm ready to keep going. But let's give our listeners a moment to digest what we've covered so far. This is a lot to take in, and I think our conversation is just getting started.
It's interesting, how this concept of grace that Paul was pushing for actually played a big role in how quickly early Christianity spread.
Oh, really? In what way?
Well, back then, most religions were pretty exclusive. Like they had all these rules and rituals you had to follow to be considered worthy or to be part of the group.
Okay, yeah.
But Christianity, with its emphasis on grace, was totally different. It was radically inclusive.
So instead of earning your way in, you were already accepted. Like it was a totally new approach to spirituality.
Exactly. It didn't matter what your social status was or your background or your past mistakes. You were welcomed and loved just as you were.
I can see how that would appeal to people.
This message of radical acceptance really resonated with people from all walks of life, especially those who felt pushed aside or excluded by the traditional religions.
Yeah, makes sense. Who wouldn't be drawn to a message that says you're already worthy? You don't have to prove anything.
It must have been incredibly liberating for people back then.
Totally. And it still is for us today.
Yeah.
But let's maybe shift gears a bit and talk about what grace actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, good idea. We've talked about how grace can change your perspective, but what does it look like in action? Like how does it affect our work, our relationships, or even just our own internal dialogue?
Okay, let's start with work. Often we approach work with this mindset of, I have to prove myself. Or I need to achieve this to be successful.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
But grace allows us to work from a different place, a place of already being enough.
So instead of fear or insecurity driving us, we work from a place of freedom and purpose.
Exactly. It's not about being lazy or complacent. It's about changing our motivation.
Right. So we work because we want to contribute. We want to use our gifts to make a difference.
Yeah. It becomes less about proving ourselves and more about expressing ourselves. I like that. It takes the pressure off and lets us find more joy and meaning in what we do. What about relationships, though? How does grace change how we relate to others?
Well, think about how much energy we spend trying to earn love and acceptance from other people. We put on these masks, we try to please everyone, we hide our flaws.
Yeah, all the time.
Right, we're terrified of being vulnerable because we think it'll make people like us less.
Oh, so true.
Yeah.
It's exhausting trying to keep up that perfect image.
It is. And grace offers us a different way. It says, you are loved and accepted just as you are, imperfections and all.
That's nice.
It allows us to take off the masks and be real in our relationships.
So grace gives us the freedom to be vulnerable, to embrace our imperfections, and to connect with others on a deeper level.
Exactly. And what about that inner critic we all have? That voice telling us we're not good enough, smart enough, successful enough.
Oh yeah, that voice.
Can grace help us with that too?
I hope so.
Absolutely. Grace reminds us that our worth isn't based on what we achieve or our successes or even our failures. Our worth is already there. It's a gift.
Right.
When we really understand that it can quiet that inner critic and create space for self-compassion.
So it's like grace gives us a whole new way of seeing ourselves.
Yeah. A lens of love and acceptance instead of judgment and comparison.
That shift in perspective can really change how we feel about ourselves. I mean, it frees us from that constant striving and lets us experience more peace and contentment.
It really does. It all starts to make sense, but it also brings up some tough questions.
Like what?
Like, if grace means we're already accepted and loved unconditionally, does that mean our actions don't matter?
That's a good question, does it?
It's a common misconception. Grace doesn't give us a free pass to do whatever we want without consequences.
Okay, so there are still consequences.
Of course. It's not about saying our actions don't matter. It's about changing what motivates us.
So it's not about earning God's love, but responding to it.
Exactly. When we understand how deeply God loves us, it naturally inspires us to live a life that reflects that love, to treat others with kindness, to fight for justice, to make a positive difference in the world.
It's like grace becomes the fuel for a life well lived, a life that has both meaning and impact.
It is. And that brings us to another big question.
What's that?
If grace is meant to change not just individuals, but society as a whole, how do we bridge the gap between the ideal and reality? How do we live out grace in a world that often seems so lacking in it?
Yeah, that's a huge question. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with each of us. It starts with choosing to live out grace in our own lives, in our relationships, in our communities.
Okay, so starting small.
Right. It starts with being willing to extend grace to others, even when they don't deserve it, even when it's hard.
So it's not just about receiving grace for ourselves, it's about becoming channels of grace for others.
Exactly. It's about making choices that reflect this radical idea of unearned love and acceptance. It's about being willing to forgive, to show compassion, to build bridges instead of walls.
That sounds beautiful, but I bet it's a lot harder to do than to talk about, especially in a world that feels so divided.
It is challenging. But I really believe it's possible. And the more we practice grace in our own lives, the more it'll spread outward, influencing our families, our communities, and eventually the whole world around us.
So this is about more than just feeling good. It's about creating a better world.
Exactly. It's about being part of a movement that wants to change our relationships, our systems, and our culture.
Okay, I'm starting to get excited about this. I see how this ancient idea of grace has the potential to be a real force for good in the world today.
Me too.
But before we get too carried away, let's take a minute to think about what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, good idea.
This is a lot to process, and I want to give our listeners some time to digest these ideas before we move on to our final thoughts. We'll be right back.
Okay, we're back, and wow, this deep dive into Galatians and grace has really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's a concept that just keeps unfolding, right? Like the more we explore it, the more we see how far-reaching it really is.
I know. We've talked about the historical context and the personal impact, but there's one thing I'm still kind of stuck on.
We touched on it a bit, but how does grace actually play out in society? Like, can it really make a difference in a world that often feels so divided and honestly kind of graceless?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, if grace really is transformative, it shouldn't just change our individual lives. It should change how we build communities and how we deal with social issues.
So how do we go from personal transformation to societal transformation? It feels like a pretty big jump.
It is a big shift, but I think it starts with understanding that grace isn't just a feel-good thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's a whole way of being in the world that challenges those structures of power and privilege that cause so much division and injustice.
So instead of systems based on exclusion and judgment, grace calls us to create systems based on inclusion and compassion.
Exactly. Think about how we approach things like poverty or inequality or even just political debates. Often it's from a place of judgment and blame, this us versus them mentality.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Grace calls us to see the inherent worth and dignity of every single person, regardless of their situation or their beliefs.
That's a whole different way of looking at things. It means letting go of our need to be right or to be in control or to have all the answers.
It does, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
But if we want a more just and compassionate world, I think it's absolutely necessary.
I agree. It's hard to even picture what that would look like.
Imagine a society where grace shapes our social policies, our legal systems, our education, even our media.
It's pretty radical.
It is a world where we prioritize restorative justice over punishment, where we focus on healing and reconciliation instead of revenge, and where we celebrate diversity and embrace our shared humanity.
So grace isn't just about personal salvation or even personal transformation. It's about building a fairer world for everyone.
Absolutely. And it starts with each of us choosing to live out grace in our daily lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Challenging oppressive systems, advocating for the marginalized, speaking out against injustice.
It's about putting our faith into action and being the change we want to see.
Yes. It's about choosing love over fear, compassion over judgment, forgiveness over resentment.
This has been an incredibly deep dive. We've explored grace from its historical roots to its impact on individuals and society. And I'm honestly left feeling hopeful. Like maybe we can create a world that's a little kinder, a little more forgiving, a little more gracious.
I feel it too. And remember, it starts with us. With each little act of grace, we're planting seeds of transformation. that can grow into a more beautiful and just world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And as we wrap up, I want you to think about what it would look like to live a life filled with grace. How would it change your relationships, your work, your interactions with the world? Let this be the start of your own deep dive into the power of grace.
Yeah, may we all keep learning and growing and being instruments of grace in a world that needs it so